There we go. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Thank you all for your patience. Well, we had some technical difficulties setting that up, but we are now live on Facebook, so we can start. I wanted to welcome everyone to our weekly tour. My name is Allison, and I'm part of the education department at the Timken. We're very excited to have you here while our museum is closed so that we can bring you our works of art virtually and you can still experience the collection. Just a couple of guidelines before we begin. So for those of you in our Zoom room, we ask that you stay muted while our docent is speaking. We'll have a big Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat box. That's that speech bubble at the bottom of your screen that says chat. You can type any questions or comments there, and then, like I said, we'll get to them at the end, or you can also just save them till the end and ask them out loud. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also join the conversation by putting all of your questions and comments in the comment section underneath the video. So we hope you enjoy the tour, whether you are on Facebook or Zoom. I'm going to turn it over at this time to Eleanor, our docent, who will be presenting the highlights of our museum.
Yes, thank you, Allison. Well, greetings and welcome to our tour of masterpieces of the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle, and I will be your docent for today's tour. We'll be touring through the museum's 5 galleries representing European and American art and a distinguished group of Russian icons, all the works dating from between 1300 and 1900. And each work tells a fascinating story reflecting its historical, cultural, and social context in which it was created. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the museum, it owes its existence to 2 families, the generosity of those families, Anne and Amy Putnam, who amassed a large art collection during their lifetimes, and the Timken family, who founded and funded the building of the museum, which opened in October 1965 as the only museum in Balboa Park that is free at all times. So let's begin with the Russian Icon Gallery, a special interest of Amy Putnam, who studied Russian art at Stanford. The source for most of the icons in this gallery was the 1918 Russian Communist Revolution, in which icons were stripped from the walls of the churches and dispersed abroad. The works in this gallery called icons, and this is Anne and Amy Putnam and Timken. The works in this gallery, which are called icons or sacred images of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and other holy figures, and are the prevalent art form within the Russian Orthodox Church. Through icons, religious stories and teachings are disseminated to the faithful, reinforcing Christian doctrine. Now, upon entering a Russian Orthodox church, you typically see a wall of icons. My pointer is showing you this wall, and it's called an iconostasis. It separates the nave from the sanctuary. Now, it might seem like the iconostasis creates a barrier for the faithful, but this isn't the case. Rather, it symbolizes the boundary between the divine and human worlds, a window through which the faithful glimpse the sacred world beyond, a bridge to the kingdom of God. Now, in the center are the royal doors, pointing to them are the royal gates, and here they are. And notice that in a prominent position just to the left of the royal gates is an icon of Mary and the Christ child. And here is Timken's version of this icon, the Georgian Mother of God, from the 17th century by the Moscow School. Now, the Virgin is always known in an icon context as the Mother of God. She's depicted in the traditional pose of the Haudegidria, which is Greek for pointer of the way or guide. And here she gestures with her right hand to the Christ child as being the way, the truth, and the life, the source of salvation for mankind. Now, notice how the religious figures are portrayed. Tradition considers the icon to have been divinely revealed, in other words, miraculously created. And as such, the authenticity of each image depends on its resemblance to the earliest divinely inspired images, as they would have been closest to the actual figures of Christ and Mary. Figures are thus represented not in their natural form, but in their two-dimensional heavenly form. And how do we see this in this work? And what do we see that tells us about this spiritual representation? Well, we have a very flattened perspective. Look at Mary's very large ears, which are better to hear the words of God, her closed mouth, because one does not speak in the presence of God, her large, almond-shaped, soulful eyes that perhaps pretend a knowledge of the future suffering of her child, and her graceful, elongated fingers with tapered ends created the sense of movement upwards toward the heavens. And of course, the 24-karat gold leaf covering, which evokes the glories of heaven and divine radiance. Now note the 3 8-pointed stars. One is behind her cape here. These are called the Stella Maris, and they are on Mary's cape or maphorium. This is her long red veil covering her head and body. And the stars symbolize eternal virginity before, during, and after the Nativity. They're the attribute, the stars are the attribute by which we know a figure is Mary. Each saint is recognized by their attribute or their symbol. Now, in addition to the imagery found in the church, the faithful had spiritual images for their personal use. And we have such an example in this delicate and ornate triptych, an early Italian panel painting entitled The Madonna of Humility by Niccolo di Buonaccorso, and it dates from 1370 to 77, actually to 75. And Niccolo di Buonaccorso was one of the most accomplished Sienese painters of the second half of the 14th century. Though small, it shows the artist's exceptional skill in rendering the figures' flowing gown and garments, the textile patterns, and the textures. In the center panel, the Virgin Mary with the Christ child on her lap is seated on a magnificent marble floor. It's quite unusual to show the Virgin seated on a floor. Behind her, on a bench of carved and inlaid wood, lie simple tools of domesticity, a spindle, bobbins with colored thread, and knitting needles. Before her marriage to Joseph, Mary had been one of the virgins chosen to weave a veil for the temple, and the sewing instrument symbolized her chastity and humility. On the left stands Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a virgin martyr famed for her beauty and learning, and she rests her arm on the spiked wheel, which is the symbol or attribute of her martyrdom. On the right is Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. He's carrying the Christ child on his shoulder across the river, but as his burden becomes heavier and heavier, he realizes the child is Jesus Christ, and Jesus has taken on the sins of mankind, carrying with him the weight of the world. In the central triangle on the top, we witness Christ's ultimate sacrifice, his crucifixion. On either side, the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she will bear the Son of God. Now, this triptych is a portable altarpiece. It's quite small, and the fact that it's portable may explain the inclusion of Saint Christopher, who was the protector of travelers. It's probably one of the first portable shrines dealing with this subject. It's worth noting that much of this time, the image would not have been seen, as the triptych would have been closed, and all you would see would be the outer. There's a geometric line drawing design on the outside of the triptych, and it would have been portable, very easily carried on trips, on tricks. Notice the decoration of the frame, very ornate, gilded and punched, and it represents the highest level to which Sienese craftsmen aspired in the 14th century. We're now going to move from Byzantine art of the East, which is quite centralized, as well as this Italian panel painting, these very stylized portraits of religious figures, and take a look at a portrait from the Renaissance period in Italy, different part of the world, and about a century earlier. Here is an intriguing young woman from the 16th century Venice, whom we call Portrait of a Lady in a Green Dress. It was painted in 1530 by Bartolomeo Veneto, and we know this because he wrote his name, he left his signature and the date of the work on this tiny cartellini over here. It's kind of a trump loy. It looks like you can pull it right off the painting. After many centuries in which generic representation had been the norm, distinctive portrait likenesses began to reappear in the 15th century, reflecting a manifestation of Renaissance humanism with its emphasis on the individual and their place in the world. And the painting portrays a woman who's dressed to the height of fashion, a fairly wealthy woman, we would surmise, and she's wearing a luxuriant dress of green silk, and at her waist is a violet colored belt, and she has a shimmering gold blouse, and the blouse is also called a fichu, a long necklace of semi-precious stones, probably lapis. The ample and puffy green sleeves are tied on separately, and they're slashed so she can pull out her underwear and show how wealthy she is, and she has the underwear. And while she probably owned only 2 or 3 of these fichu or bodice tops, she probably had 10 pairs of these arms which she could attach and detach and mix and match to get a lot of different looks. Now, a bit unusual are her heavy brown leather gloves. And we don't quite know why the artist included these, but perhaps they were used to show that she partook in falconry, in the sport of falconry. And she's wearing the glove on her right hand, which tells us, if this were falconry, that she's left-handed. She wears an elaborate headdress called a scuffia, which is adorned with gold and ribbon and a white rosette attached in the center with a jeweled pin. She has lovely Titian ginger reddish hair, likely dyed with henna, which was very highly admired at the time. Now take a look at her expression. Bartolomeo intrigues us with hints of her personality. It's a rather piercing, slightly wary, petulant expression as she turns her head to us as though she just notices we're here. Such subtle animation was groundbreaking at the time, revealing an interest in human emotion, drama, and nature. Now, I'd like to just quickly compare this work with an earlier work just by 30 years by Antonio Giovanni Beltraffio, and this is called Portrait of a Youth Holding an Arrow. And the modeling of his fur tunic is exquisite, just as with Our Lady's dress. But notice the facial features. They are still reflecting the idealistic representations that were typical just 30, 50 years earlier. If this person if we had a lineup in front of us, I don't think we'd be able to identify who this individual was, whereas with Our Lady in the green dress, we definitely know who she was. Now, the identity of the lady in the green dress was a mystery until recently, when a PhD candidate with UCSD did extensive research, and she offered evidence that the young woman may be Maria Paleologo, who was engaged to be married to the son of Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, a very famous fashion leader and patron of the arts. The link between the two is the ornamental headdress, or the scuffia, which Isabella gave to those marrying into the d'Este family. So here's the Titian portrait of the Marchesa wearing the same headdress. So that's how we know who she is. Then the mystery was solved. We'll now leave the Renaissance period and look at a work in the gallery about 100 years later, painted during what is known as the Baroque period. And this work is Return of the Prodigal Son. And this painting tells us a story, a biblical parable of the return of the prodigal son. And it's taken from the New Testament gospel according to Luke. It's the parable most frequently represented in Western art as teaching the twin virtues of repentance and forgiveness. The work was created in 1654 by the northern Italian artist Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, more commonly known as Il Guercino, which translates to the squinter, because he was born cross-eyed. While born to a poor family, his talent was recognized early on, and he went to work for Pope Gregory XV in Rome. Guercino painted 7 versions of this work, starting in 1617, this one being the last, and it was commissioned by the Archbishop of Bologna. Here's an earlier version. Note the muted palette and totally different composition of the 3 figures, but you do still have the 3 figures, the same 3 figures represented quite differently. The biblical narrative tells the story of a young man who asks for his inheritance early in life, and he squanders it on wine, women, and song. He ends up looking after pigs, and it dawns on him that his father's servants live a better life than he does. The Timken painting shows the moment the son, penitent, weeping, full of shame and remorse, and dressed in rags, returns to his father's home, and here the father embraces him warmly, wrapping his son in his cloak and dispatching his servant to bring new clothes. The rueful son averts his gaze, saying, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy name. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father, full of joy, says to his servant, "Let's eat and be merry, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again, was lost and now is found." Guercino emphasizes the emotions associated with the father's forgiveness and the son's shame and remorse, focusing our attention on their interlocking hands. Emotions are further enriched by Guercino's dramatic use of color. The vibrant red of the father's robe, a patch of brilliant blue sky, and the lustrous fabric shown on the father's purple robe and the servant's pants are all characteristics of the Baroque style, which introduced a very dramatic imagery to scenes and action in a work. Now, to put the work in context, recall that during this time, the Catholic Church, as part of the Counter-Reformation efforts, was using Baroque art as a means of calling back their faithful who had left the church following the Protestant Reformation. Notice how the servant boy engages the viewer with his direct gaze as a witness to the events unfolding before him, not as a participant in the narrative. He looks at the viewer and, pulling back the curtain, invites us into this story of grace, forgiveness, and salvation as he beckons the faithful back to the church, regardless of what they've done. Come back home, we forgive, we're welcoming. One might consider this dramatic work as a recruitment tool, the advertising of its day. and thus ends the story of the prodigal son. Now, before leaving the Italian gallery, let's stop briefly at a work by the Spanish artist Zurbarán, Saint Francis in Meditation, which dates from 1635. Zurbarán is recognized as one of the greatest Spanish paintings of the Baroque period, the 17th century, and his commissions came primarily from religious orders in Seville, where he established a studio in 1629. Saint Francis of Assisi was a mystic, poet, and founder of the Franciscans, a mendicant order. Interestingly, though, his pointed cap is that of the Capuchin order, which may mean that that order commissioned the work. Zurbarán painted approximately 34 versions of St. Francis. In this composition, we see him deeply in prayer, in ecstasy, with his face illuminated from the left. Zurbarán uses somber, rich color and an intense play of light and shadow to create a highly dramatic moment of contemplation. Now notice the skull. The skull in this work is known as a memento mori, remembrance of death. Keep this in mind as we move into the Dutch and Flemish gallery and take a look at a new genre of art, the still life, in a work by Pieter Cleyes. Cleyes was the foremost still life painter in Haarlem, the leading center of artistic life in 17th century Holland. It was done in 1627, early in his career. Now, the Dutch invented the still life as we know it today, for which we can thank the Protestant Reformation. Its emphasis on the individual's direct relationship with God led to the abrupt decline in ecclesiastical patronage for large-scale religious paintings. Rather, there developed a new group of customers for a new type of art. These were the newly emerging members of the Dutch Protestant middle classes, property owners, factory workers, merchants, and craftsmen, and other respectable burghers of affluent cities like Amsterdam and Haarlem. Cleyes specialized in a type of picture that his countrymen called breakfast pieces, or eindbies, small bites. And these are comprised of ingredients from an ordinary, informal meal. So in this case, we have smoking supplies, a goblet of dark beer, a brazier glowing with embers, arranged around a pewter plate with smoked herring in the foreground, tipping close to the edge of the table. But Cleyes knew about sumptuous meals also, and he painted these on occasion. Known as vanitas paintings, these works were ripe with symbolic objects intended to emphasize the transience of life, the futility of earthly pleasure, and the pointless quest for power and glory. Here's such a work done later in Cleyes's career. It was done in the 1950s. But now notice the presence of the skull, the bones, and the extinguished candle. Vanitas are closely related to that earlier tradition I just showed you of memento mori, Latin for remember you must die. These are artworks intended to prompt viewers to consider their mortality. But the humble spread shown in the Timken picture suggests different ideas. Whoever consumes this meal doesn't necessarily need to be reminded that the good life only lasts a little while. This particular example of the breakfast pieces genre represents what ordinary life in Haarlem might have been like. Now, in addition to the still life, the Dutch also invented landscape painting as we know it today. And Pieter Bruegel, the elder, considered one of the greatest Flemish painters, was its master. In this painting, Bruegel depicts the Bible's parable of the sower. More than any other painter, Bruegel helped free landscape from its dependence on religion, partly as a reflection of this newly grasped sense of the vastness and variety of the earth. Remember the importance of the Dutch in world trade at this time. They were the world travelers and the explorers, and painters began increasing the space and depth of their landscape paintings. In the distance of this painting, you can see that we have a busy port with ships on their way out to sea. And now Bruegel had recently returned to Antwerp following a 2-year stay in Rome. And this landscape from 1557 is an evocation of scenery he'd seen on his trip. So if I were to ask you what's the landscape of the Netherlands, you would definitely say it's flat, but this is evoking the scenery from the Alps over which Bruegel had recently crossed. Now, the biblical story, the parable of the sower, is played out in the foreground at the left, where a humble peasant scatters seeds on rocky soil. The house behind him is lit by the morning sun. According to St. Matthew, some seeds fell by the wayside and the birds devoured them. Some fell in stony places where they didn't have much earth, and some fell among thorns, but others fell into fertile ground and brought forth root. The picture is cut diagonally with a wide river, indicating there are two parts to the story. At the lower right, a dirt path leads us down across the water, and we see a small group of people who are gathering on the other side to listen to Jesus deliver his message of salvation. And like the seeds falling on the soil, some will not listen to him, but others will heed his words, and faith will blossom in them. This is a good time to lighten up a bit, change the colors and the ethos by venturing into the French gallery, where we'll move into the 18th century in the Rococo style of art, which flourished in France from about 1720 to 1780. Here we are at Francois Boucher's Lovers in the Park from 1758. Works such as these intended to decorate the interiors of grand salons, and they're a display of nonchalant whimsy, carefree demeanor reflecting the lighter Rococo style, which was characterized by greater informality, decorative scrollwork, pastel colors, and a general sense of gaiety and frivolity. So why the Rococo style at this time in France? Well, in 1715, King Henry XIV, who was a control freak, mandating the aristocracy to be with him in Versailles, died. His great-grandson, Louis XV, who was just a boy, took over the throne, and the aristocrats returned home in relief and started decorating the salons of their grand mansions. The painting depicts an aristocratic couple and their spaniel seated in an overgrown garden, resting under a pair of Amorini angels who playfully mimic their position. The young man is picking flowers from his lover's hat and weaving them into her hair, while eyeing the shepherdess, who appears to just have landed. There's no real path there, seems to just have landed on the scene. His flirtatious glance is held and reciprocated by her as his lover looks aimlessly out with a blank stare or an all-knowing resignation. Not coincidentally, the spaniel in this case represents fidelity, exactly what we don't have in the young gentleman's flirtation. Now, during the 18th century, it was fashionable for the aristocracy to escape from the strict etiquette of the French court by going to secluded rustic retreats and living there as though they were simple country people. On these retreats, They dressed in elaborate versions of peasant clothing and strolled in private gardens. The milkmaids' beribboned garments are the kind of idealized peasant garb that the rich sported for fun by the rich, the aristocratic royal and late aristocratic ladies of the time. Now, here's a work by Boucher's contemporary Fragonard, which is entitled Blind Man's Buff, and it shows the same Rococo characteristics of the pastel colors, curved and scrolled lines, and the playful theme of lovers in the country. And this is a much smaller work in our gallery, and it is placed right next to the Boucher, so you can take a look at these two wonderful Rococo artists. Born in 1703, Francois Boucher was perhaps the most celebrated painter and decorative artist of 18th century France. He was a great favorite of the court and did many paintings for King Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. She adored him. In addition to his paintings, Boucher designed tapestries, first for the royal workshops at Beauvais, and in 1755 was appointed director of the Royal Gobelin workshops. He also created designs for the Sèvres porcelain factory. So take a look at your tea set and see if it might be a work printed on it by Boucher. His works explored joyous, playful themes of young lovers and lush gardens or lavish bedrooms, flirting, playing games, involved in the eternal game of love. Hence, the philosopher Denis Diderot's criticism of Boucher, quote, "That man is capable of everything except the truth," end of quote. By the 1780s, however, there was a move away from Rococo frivolity to the more severe neoclassical period, more in sync with the moral climate of the final years of the French monarchy. Jacques-Louis David, considered the preeminent neoclassical painter of his day, was best known for his huge history paintings, characterized by themes and styles from ancient Greece and Rome. While not in our galleries, here's one of his best known works, The Oath of Herati. I just wanted to show you one of Jacques-Louis David's heroic neoclassical, looking back to classical times, one of those works. But the Timken's intimate portrait of the Irish timber merchant Cooper Penrose reveals why David was also considered the first great portrait painter of the 17th century. Born in 1748 in Paris into a wealthy family, he overcame his parents' opposition to becoming a painter. Interestingly, his first teacher was Boucher, master of the Rococo style. Cooper Penrose, a Quaker, traveled from Ireland to Paris in 1802 to commission David to paint his portrait, fully aware of his reputation. As Penrose's wealth had grown in the timber business, he'd become an avid collector of art, antiques, and other worldly treasures, and he lived on a 40-acre estate with a lavish home, which was referred to as the Irish Vatican. It's said that his tastes were so lavish that the Society of Friends threatened to expel him. The finished painting, a 3/4 length portrait, shows Penrose appearing to be a small man at 66 years of age, seated stiffly in a mahogany neoclassical armchair. He's dressed simply in a somber black cutaway jacket, a white waistcoat, dark gray knee breeches, and white stockings, without even a ring or scarf pin to sound a showy note befitting his Quaker beliefs. So this might have been the way he desired his portrait to be presented in deference to his Quaker heritage. because there's no evidence here of the sitter's high social status. He's elegantly dressed, but there's nothing else that would tell you about his great wealth or frivolous lifestyle. But notice how Jacques-Louis David brings our attention to Cooper Penrose's face and hands, kind of creating a triangle for us, which is a very stable position. And here David does reveal Penrose's complex personality. Look at those silver flips of hair on the side of his head, suggests a flair for personal style. He's got ruddy cheeks, a robust delight of life, and the eyes, which are crowned by strong arched eyebrows, have a glint of shrewdness. Even his mouth has a slightly quizzical look, or somewhat like the Mona Lisa's. And notice the hands, they're animated. One is hanging down, vain and elegant, and the other with fingers touching, ready to hold a manuscript, a pair of reading glasses, or engage in conversation. This is a man who would enjoy, we would think, a good conversation. But note that David was more than a painter. He was also as political an artist as ever lived, a leader of the French Revolution, which landed him in jail for 2 years. He was allied with Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. No sooner was he out of prison that David managed once again to align himself with the leader of yet another political figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon admired David's paintings and appointed him the official first court painter and gave him France's highest medal of honor. Let's now move on to the American gallery, the last gallery in our tour, to admire 2 works. The first, a wonderful portrait of an elegant colonial lady shrouded in a bit of mystery. The year is 1771, and the location is New York City. The sitter is Margaret Kemble Gage, wife of General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America. And the painter is John Singleton Copley of Boston, colonial America's most influential painter, who'd come to New York City to paint the social class, the A-listers of the time. The son of Irish immigrants living in Boston and largely self-taught, Copley was a determined and ambitious young man. By the time he was 20, he'd become colonial Boston's leading portrait painter and the first American painter to live in a style and earn a social status comparable to that of his patrons. Copley's tremendous success was rooted in his ability to appeal to his sitters' desire to be portrayed on a par with their English counterparts. And what was quite the rage at this time was Turkery, or dressing in the Turkish style. Now, notice for a moment, this is the portrait that Copley did of General Thomas Gage 3 years earlier. And certainly the general wished himself to be presented, in a image to which he aspired to be a stalwart general, a very traditional portrait image of the time. Now back to Mrs. Gage. In this 3/4 length portrait, we see a relaxed, serene, confident woman seated languidly on a dark blue velvet sofa, her curved arm and hand supporting her head. She's depicted wearing an uncorseted, iridescent rose caftan over a loosely trimmed cream-trimmed chemise. A deep red jewel is at her neck, And she's got an embroidered blue belt, which matches, an embroidered blue belt, which matches the ribbon and the color and the embroidery on her hair. And notice the colors that Copley used. Remember that Copley would not have seen the paintings of the great masters in Europe. So his use of color and his creation of texture, you can almost feel this dress crinkling, the taffeta of the dress was really quite remarkable. And you notice her Turkish scarf wound around her head. Now, I mentioned Turkey was all the rage in Britain at the time, and people would go to costume balls. We didn't have costume balls in the Americas, so Mrs. Gage probably collaborated with Copley to come up with this image in her Turkey style. And Copley was particularly pleased with this portrait. He wrote, I quote, "It is, I think, beyond compare, the best lady's portrait I ever drew." Upon completion, end of quote, upon completion, he sent it to London for exhibition, after which it hung in Firle Place, which was the Gage family home, until it was purchased by the Putnam Foundation. In 1774, Copley, who had returned to Boston, finally fulfilled his wish to study the great works of art and left Boston for his longed for trip to Europe, his grand tour, and he never returned home. As for Mrs. Gage, we have an unsolved mystery. Was she a colonial informant? General Gage had secret plans to destroy the Patriot armories in Lexington and Concord and to place the leaders into custody. But an informant who was connected to the British High Command alerted the Patriots. Perhaps it was Mrs. Gage. She was born in America. She was actually a third generation American. So she would have had some alliance to America, and as well as her alliance to Britain due to her marriage to General Thomas Gage. Now, there's no proof of her complicity, but it's revealing that Mrs. Gage and her 10 children were sent off to England shortly after this work was done in April 1775, supposedly to tend to the family estate. And General Gage was recalled later that year. We don't really know about her relationship to General Gage, after the battles of Concord and Lexington, but she did have an 11th child in Britain, so the relationship was probably maintained. We're now ready for the final painting in our tour, a work by Eastman Johnson. In 1880, when Eastman Johnson completed arguably his greatest painting, Cranberry Harvest, Island of Nantucket, he was already one of the best known American artists of his era. Born in Lovell, Maine in 1824, he began his career in 1845 doing portraits of prominent individuals and then genre scenes of the South during the Civil era. Around 1870, after searching for aspects of American rural life to use as subjects for ambitious paintings, the 46-year-old painter, just recently married, first visited Nantucket Island south of Cape Cod, and he returned there throughout the next several decades. With this view of a cranberry harvest, he successfully realized his efforts to paint a celebration of New England outdoor life. He wrote to an artist friend, and I quote, "I was taken with my cranberry fit as soon as I arrived. Some people have rose fever yearly. I have the cranberry fever." As they began picking in a meadow a day or two after we arrived, "I've done nothing else since I've been here, not a thing." End of quote. So he was kind of obsessed with getting the imagery just as he wanted it, just at the time of day he wanted it. He probably made 17 oil paintings, 1 watercolor, and 2 drawings of the harvest before completing this sprawling late afternoon canvas, as evidenced by the warm yellow glow of the sun. And I want to show you some of the preliminary drawings. Here are 4 of the preliminary watercolorings, and you could see how each one represented different figures, which he ultimately put back together to get this work of over 40 figures. And the work is a tribute to the agrarian life at the moment when the US was industrializing at a dizzying pace and when wealth was being amassed at an equal clip. And it provides perhaps a look back to a simpler time. The central figure in the work of about 40 figures, as I mentioned, is a woman standing with an illuminated bonnet who is looking toward a young boy holding a baby, presumably her, presumably her baby. And at the center is a man who has brought a chair with him to make picking easier. And at the far left are children in conversation about something which is happening off stage. And at the far right are the young folks who are loading the harvest into the wagon. Now note the windmill in the distance. This windmill was not located there in this view. It's actually on the other side of the island, but he wanted the viewers to recognize this as Nantucket, and that windmill would do the trick. Now, I mentioned, these his preparatory drawings, and I also wanted to mention, notice the very light brush stroke of his work. And you might consider these works as representative of American Impressionism, because it was contemporaneous with Monet in France. And a telling measure of the work's importance for the artist is that, as far as we know, he never again attempted a work even remotely like it. Rather, he returned to New York and went back to doing portraits, which he'd done early in his career, and he did portraits of renowned individuals for the remainder of his career. Our tour has now come to a close. I know it's been quite a whirlwind through our galleries, and hope you enjoyed hearing the stories our masterworks have to tell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. We'll be giving you a virtual round of applause. That was a great look at, everything that our collection encompasses. And that's one of my favorite things about our collection, is that there's so many different cultures or countries represented, styles and eras. So that was a great look at all of them. I want to open it now up to questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can go ahead and send them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself at this time and ask out loud. And same thing for our viewers on Facebook. You can also put your questions in the comments on Facebook. And maybe while people are thinking, if there's not any, I can get us started. You kind of actually ended up answering my question that I had, but that was when I was looking at the cranberry harvesters, and I was looking at like the color palette, and I was just curious because it is kind of a muted color palette. And so do you know anything about like why that was chosen? Was it, you kind of mentioned the Impressionist movement, and so I feel like maybe that answered it, but I'm not sure. Or is it just to depict the afternoon light? I don't know.
Yeah, I think he was trying to show the effect of the sunlight, washing all of those colors, out there. And I think the color palette helped to emphasize, the time of day. This was late in the afternoon, so the sun, the placement of the sun on the horizon, was affected, I think, his color palette.
Because he would have painted it outside, right? Like
he would have painted his sketches.
Okay.
He would have completed the work in his studio.
Okay, gotcha. But he was experiencing it kind of as
he was experiencing it at the time, which is why, he did at least 17, oils, which can be seen in some of the other museums and in some other museums. And so he really did labor over the composition to get it exactly correct. And I think it is telling that he, after he completed it, he put it aside and he never did this kind of genre scene again. It's really quite remarkable, the range of his subject matter over his life. You know, portraits of renowned individuals. I believe his father had connections in Washington, D.C., and he was able to, early in his career, do portraits of renowned individuals. You know, because of that connection, and then later in his career and did portraits in New York.
Yeah, and that makes it even more interesting because that's the whole point, I think, of that the cranberry harvest, is that we're just seeing kind of normal people. We're not seeing specific, even, you know, famous individuals or anything. We're not seeing a Mrs. Gage type. We're kind of seeing just normal people going about their work. So yeah, definitely an interesting change that he kind of made there. And yeah, like you mentioned with the Impressionists, I was so struck by how one of the drawings really reminded me of like the haystacks, like, you know, I think it's Monet,
Yes,
right? The
yes.
haystacks, yeah.
Yeah, the Monet works. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it really shows you how, like, when people first saw Monet's work, it was kind of like, oh, it's unfinished, and he's like, no, 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 that's how it's supposed to look, because that's what the sketches look like. So
Yeah.
yeah, kind of interesting. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Again, you can unmute yourself if you'd like. All right, well, we have a couple comments in the chat just saying thank you, Eleanor, for such a great tour. So
Thank you.
if there are no questions, I think I'll go ahead and end it there. I just want to remind everyone that we do have these every week. So we hope to see you here next week at 11 a.m. We will be doing a focus on the American Gallery. So if you liked Mrs. Gage, if you liked the Cranberry Harvesters, we'll be looking at more American art next week. So thank you very much, Eleanor.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you all.